The rise of Christian nationalism is what I would call an almost pristine example of Babylon. This is Babylon. This is what the dragon wants. He wants people in the Capitol building threatening to tear down the place and to think they can make it a Christian nation. Jesus doesn't win with a sword in his fist, but by the word that comes from his mouth.
Hello, my beautiful friends. I can't see you, but I know you're all beautiful. So hello and welcome back to the new Evangelicals podcast. It's so good to have you with me. On this episode, I interviewed Scot McKnight. Yeah, that's right. The one and only. Scot's a pretty prolific writer. One of his books, The Blue Parakeet, really helped me understand the Bible and the Christian tradition in a very different way when I was going through some of my early deconstruction moments. And so I was so grateful to have Scot back on. He wrote a book called Revelation for the Rest of Us, a prophetic call to follow Jesus as a dissident disciple. This is a very interesting conversation because Scot has a different take than Bart Ehrman has on Revelation. Now, if you want to listen to my conversation with Bart, who wrote a book called Armageddon about Revelation, go back a few episodes and find it. It's worth listening to. And this will be a very different take, but I think a very helpful take as well. Scot and I talk about just how Revelation has been misused and abused and how we need to see it as a critique of empire, and as Christians, our obligation to critique the empire. And if you are wondering if we go into that topic, yes, we do. So I will let Scot and myself answer how we talk about that topic for you in just a few minutes. But I want to say, Scot, thank you so much for coming on. And friends, thank you so much for your support, for sharing the podcast, for listening. If you can give us a rating and a review on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, whatever, that would be so helpful. And if you want to support the work that we do, we are a nonprofit organization holding space for thousands of people who are going through a crisis of theology. They're trying to renegotiate their faith to become a better Jesus follower. And that's what our organization does as a nonprofit. And we offer all of our content totally paywall free, which means there's no Patreon. There's no monthly subscription you have to pay to get all of our content. We're able to do this because of the generosity of people like you. So you can click on the show notes or the link in our show notes, and you can donate there. All donations are tax deductible in the US. All right, friends, without further ado, here's my interview with Scot McKnight. Talk to y'all later. All right. Well, I got to say, Dr. Scot McKnight, it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast. I need to also inform you that I owe you a thank you because I read your book, The Blue Parakeet, quite a few years ago, and it was incredibly formative for me where I was in my faith journey. And I found the book so helpful to give language to what I was going through at the time. And it gave me a sense of obligation to, as you say in the book, take the Christian tradition and push it in our day and our way for, a better future. So thank you for writing that book. And I'm looking forward to having you on to talk about this one, Revelation for the Rest of Us, a prophetic call to follow Jesus as a dissident disciple. So thanks for making time.
Well, thank you, Tim. And it's very kind of you to speak of the Blue Parakeet. It's been a surprise seller for Zondervan. They and I had a hard time convincing them of the title, Blue Parakeet. But I won that one. I don't always win these ones with titles. And it's been a real fun book to participate in.
Well, a lot of people that find us are usually in the beginning of what you could call deconstructing, but they want to stay faithful to Jesus. And that's a book I recommend all the time. Like, hey, this is one of the ones that you need to add to your reading list and just get a different perspective. So again, thank you for writing it. But we're not here to talk about that book today. Today, we're talking about a new book that you wrote. Before we do that, would you mind giving us some of your own background? Did you grow up evangelical, and why this book today? We'd love to hear kind of those two things.
Yeah. Did I grow up evangelical? No, I didn't even hear that word when I grew up. I heard the word fundamentalist. We were Christian fundamentalists, conservative Baptists in the Conservative Baptist Church of America, something like that. CBA, Conservative Baptist America. Midwest, northwestern Illinois. And then I gave my life to Christ as a high school between my junior and senior year, along with my girlfriend, who's now my wife. And I began to study the Bible, read the Bible through in the first 9 months of my senior year. Well, I guess that'd be the whole senior year, but I started in the summer, in July. And in the King James Version, of course.
Of course.
And then I also got very interested in Christian prophecy. And I studied books that my parents and church and youth pastors suggested I look at. And they were along the line of Hal Lindsey's late great Planet Earth, although I didn't know about that book. I read a man named Salem Kurban. He had a book called Guide to Survival. And it was about how it was a book designed for people who didn't get raptured, found themselves in the tribulation, and needed a manual to help them live in the tribulation to know what was going on.
They think about everything, don't they?
Yeah, it was. And I've heard that Hal Lindsey actually got his ideas of his book from Salem Kurban's clever stuff.
Huh.
So that was a part of my past, and that. I guess that answers the question that you were asking.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So as you grew up, I mean, I'm assuming you didn't stay a fundamentalist forever, but obviously you're a prolific writer. You're obviously a Christian. So what was that journey like for you?
Yeah, I went through, I'm actually writing a book with a student of mine. Well, he's a graduate. And we wanted to call it The Prophetic Voice of Deconstruction.
Oh.
But it wasn't, the publisher is not too keen on that title, thinks it's a little too academic. Okay. And so we're going to have something like Losing Your Religion Without Losing Jesus, something like that. Mm-hmm. Well, so when I was in college, I began to read thinkers, like in those days, Francis Schaeffer, who was critical of the American church. And so I was led to begin deconstructing the fundamentalism that I grew up with, mostly when I was a college junior and senior. By the time I got to seminary, which I went immediately from college, I graduated in 76 from college, and in the fall of 76, I was enrolled in seminary. A friend of mine who also went to seminary with me, I believe it was the next year, asked me one day to write something up of what I believed. And I realized when I wrote up, it was just on a couple pieces of paper, I realized that I knew a whole lot more of what I didn't believe than what I did believe.
Yeah.
And that is really a sign of deconstruction. And it took me several years, all the way through my PhD years, for me to come to terms with not only what I no longer wanted to believe in, but also what I did believe in. So it was a sort of a deconstruction, reconstruction process. And I have found, now maybe, Tim, you know more about this than I do, but I got hold of a study the other day, pretty big study, that people who use the word deconstruction are almost always involved. They don't leave the church. They reconstruct their faith. And those are the ones who like the word deconstruction. So I went through that phase, let's say from 1976 to about 1983. 7 years of tribulation. There you go. And I came to terms with the fact that what I believed in was Jesus.
Yeah.
Who I believed in.
Yep.
And that the church at that time for me was good and bad, but I wasn't committed to the church the way I was committed to Jesus.
Yeah.
And over time, Jesus, in many ways, has led me to the church in a more chastened form.
Yeah. I love that. And I would say, I'm not aware of that study. I would actually love to see it because I love reading those things. But I would say that my experience is in line with that, because what I tell people often is, listen, many of us are not having a crisis of faith. We're having a crisis of theology, like a big difference. I'm not worried. I'm not worried about losing my faith in God or Jesus, but what do I believe about this Jesus or about the Bible or about my faith tradition? Especially for a lot of people in my circles, and I'm one of these people, Scott. 2016 was a moment where something was so smelly, I had to follow the scent and say something doesn't add up in my own evangelical heritage, right? But I my motivation wasn't to leave what I believed. It was that what I thought I believed wasn't matching up to the behaviors I was seeing in my own circles, right? So I think what you said is really great, and I appreciate you sharing that, because a lot of us are new to this journey, right? A lot of people are freaking out and go, is there any hope? And we're trying to say there is. You have to keep going, but it's very possible, I would argue, more beautiful to follow Jesus in different ways than maybe how I was initially taught. Because I grew up very much John MacArthur-ish, so very much fundamentalist, even though I call it evangelical now. So, okay, so here we are.
Yeah, but John MacArthur captured the term evangelical, because at one time he would have been in a group that would never have called themselves evangelical, because if they grew up in fundamentalism, and MacArthur did, he's always been a fundamentalist. When the evangelical movement arose after Carl Henry in the 60s and 70s, they were much more open-minded toward culture.
Yes.
And MacArthur would have chastened those, but it was only in the 80s and 90s with Reagan, when Reagan got all these people back, that all of a sudden these people were all calling themselves evangelicals.
Yeah.
I remember the days. It wasn't fair.
Yeah. I'm currently reading a book by Isaac Sharp called The Other Evangelicals. It's an amazing book in history. I've been really enjoying it. And it just, for me, so helpful to understand the complicated history of evangelicalism in America. I think you're absolutely spot on. So, okay, so why a book on Revelation? I mean, you wrote a church called Tove. You wrote The Blue Parakeet. You've written other books, and now you're tackling Revelation. Why this book, and why now?
I've always gravitated to writing things about what I'm interested in, rather than what, let's say, textbook type things. So I'm interested in things where I think I've got something to say that needs to be said, that will probably rub against the grain of American evangelicalism, etc. So I got interested in Revelation in high school, as I mentioned. Also in college, I started reading on the rapture question like crazy, and read books on Revelation. I read a bunch of stuff. And I even wanted to take a course on eschatology at my Christian college, and my professor wouldn't let me in the class. He said, we'll meet every other week in my office. He said, I don't want you in the class. It'll just be between you and me. So then really I gave up on eschatology, because I just thought it was a fruitless battle. And speculation about Gorbachev being the Antichrist, or Kissinger being the Antichrist,
right,
or somebody else, somebody in Russia, somebody in Israel, somewhere.
Yeah.
I just found it to be a waste of time, and I kind of lost contact. But over the years, as a professor, I would be teaching a course where I had to give a lecture or two per semester on Revelation, and I just kept thinking about it, and I read stuff about it, and I worked on it. And then all of a sudden, about 3 years ago, maybe, one of my students says to me, in our next class, could you teach a course on Revelation? And my response was, I'd like to, but I can't, because it doesn't fit in my schedule right now. But then like a year or two later, so this is maybe 5 years ago, I thought, I've got time to do this now. I want to work on Revelation and put together what I've been reading and thinking about Jewish apocalyptic literature, etc. And so I taught a course a couple years back on Revelation. I had a graduate assistant named Cody Matchett, who became the co-author with me on this book. And I loved preparing the lectures. Took a whole year to prepare lectures, worked out the details, read the major commentaries, Cody and I did, and kind of sorted stuff out. And then I told Cody while we were teaching the class, I said, this is going to turn into a book. I think we got something to say. So in about December, before the class was actually over, I started writing the book and just was writing sections. And okay, so now that's how it happened, but the reason I wanted to is because, Tim, I'm really serious. I think the way most of my students grew up in evangelicalism with the book of Revelation was a form of divine abuse. It was to use the Bible to manipulate people's feelings, their decisions, their will, their bodies. And I just thought, this is so wrong. I remember lecturing at a school one day, and I said, I think that's just total hooey, dispensationalism. And someone said, hey, our theology prof is a dispensationalist. I went, oh, I'm sorry. Okay. So, but I just thought, after reading Jewish apocalyptic literature, understanding how fiction, fantasy, that sort of literature works, the speculation of who in the modern world, Vladimir Putin, is doing what in the Bible, Revelation 13's beast,
right,
completely misunderstands what the book is trying to do. Right? The book more or less identifies the city, Babylon, as Rome, and the kings of Rome are called emperors, so it's one of those emperors, anywhere from Nero to Domitian. And I thought, it's not trying to be secretive about this. I mean, a little bit, but, let the reader understand, which means, you can figure this out if you're thinking about it.
Right.
So I just thought the people it was totally wrong, and I wanted to provide a different approach along the line of some of the other thinkers who don't write as accessible prose as I thought I could write. And and I think to be frank with you, I think the speculation approach of dispensationalism that is so popular on TV destroys not only the message of the book, but it destroys the opportunity to develop a way of living that discerns political corruption, whether it is in Washington, D.C., Berlin, Cape Town, or in my local church or in my local community. And instead of producing escapists who say, we won't be here during the tribulation, it produces people who have discerning capacities to become dissidents of political corruption in the world. So there you go.
For our audience, when you say dispensationalism, you're talking about like the Left Behind series kind of way of thinking about the end of the world, where the Christians get raptured and everyone who's not really a Christian gets left behind. Is that the idea of what you're talking about?
Yep, that's dispensationalism.
Okay, cool. I mean, frankly, I think a lot of people who are listening grew up on that. I've seen the movies, etc. It gave me a lot of nights of praying just in case the rapture was going to come back.
Well, the other thing is, Tim, I don't know if you noticed this, it is also so tied to Americanism.
Oh, yeah.
Patriot. I mean, the Left Behind series not only took place in the Chicago suburbs. My daughter read every volume and laughed about it. She didn't believe it, she told me, but it's probably infiltrated her thinking. But it's so tied to American politics that when you finish this sort of Left Behind stuff, you begin to think that America and Israel are the true nations in the world, and all other nations are either on the dock in trouble, or they definitely are on the side of Babylon.
I mean, listen, a big part of the work that we do and that I do personally is we track Christian nationalism. I mean, I've been to the events, I follow it very closely, and you're absolutely right. In fact, there's also a book I read a little while ago. Forgot the author; he actually passed away, but it was called A Brief History of Christian Zionism. And I had no idea how interwoven dispensationalist theology was to the reason why the current nation state of Israel even exists today. And so I think you're right. Like, I think that sometimes people underestimate how powerful this way of viewing Revelation has been in our American psyche. It's way beyond just a couple movies. I mean, it really impacts politics. Politicians like Lauren Boebert, for example, have an eschatology like this, and that impacts how they govern and what policies they advocate for. So I think you're spot on saying that this topic, and even this book in particular, Revelation, is way more powerful as far as how it's interpreted than I think a lot of people give it credit for, frankly.
Yeah.
So I am curious, as you were writing your lectures and you're teaching on this, and you started doing maybe a deeper dive on Revelation for you, anything stick out to you? Anything surprise you? Maybe that you weren't prepared to read or interpret as you were preparing for the book and writing it?
Because I've been a professor for 40 years.
Wow.
Because I've been teaching this kind of stuff for a long time. Little things are in my head, and I might make a statement, 3 statements in a class about it, and then move on. But I had never gotten the opportunity to dig down and write about it, and then start thinking about it and reading about it, and then so. Yes, there were some surprises, but mostly it was the opportunity, the freedom to start working through this book in light of the ideas that I had. All right, so here are a couple things.
Yeah.
One thing that really has stood out to me is that you have to read Revelation, for most of us, beginning in chapters 17, 18, and 19 with Babylon, the whore of Babylon, in order to understand what John is actually addressing, the problem of Babylon. And this is empire marked by all sorts of things. And we, in our book, Cody and I discussed the 7 marks of Babylon. So that's one thing I thought we got to begin there. It's not quite reading Revelation backwards like I did with Romans, but it's close. It's starting at 17, not 22, although you could begin in 22. All right. The second thing that I noticed is if you read Revelation well, you have to read it as a narrative. The narrative, it's got chunks. Chapter 1, chapter 2 through 3 to the churches, 4 through 5, these visions in heaven. 6 through 16 is all about the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls, these judgments. Totally interrupted, constantly interrupted with these little scenes. And then 17 through 19 is Babylon. 20 through 22 is basically New Jerusalem. Now, here's the key. I tell my students, if you don't want New Jerusalem, this book is not going to be of any value to you. And if you don't despise the empire of Babylon and Rome, this book is of no value to you. So if you're in a world where you're experiencing and are really bothered by injustices and you want justice, this book of Revelation is unbelievably valuable. I just saw a tweet someone wrote to me, I think it's a pastor, yesterday. I'm not quite sure how tweets work, so I don't know if someone wrote to you or whatever. The key thing is, he said, I think the book of Revelation is the most relevant book in the Bible for today. Now, that was in light of this reading that I'm given. So you have to read it in light of wanting it. It's not simply heaven, although in a Christian doctrine of heaven, it gets there. The big point is New Jerusalem is going to be justice. And the pit of Hades in the book of Revelation functions as the place where evil is destroyed. It's not about eternal torture. That's not what's going on there, although it uses strong language. Third thing is, this is what I think can really help people who are, especially if they're deconstructing their faith. I think deconstructionists should love the book of Revelation. It has to be read like Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter or Chronicles of Narnia, whichever form you like, rather than some kind of predictive prophecy. Yeah. It's fiction in a sense. It's describing all this gruesome stuff in the world that needs to be undone. The fourth thing is people need an imagination to like this book. This is full of weird things. For instance, in chapter 5, John is wailing or weeping because there's no one worthy who can open this scroll with 7 seals on it. And someone tells him, an angel tells him, the Lion of Judah, he can do it. And the next thing he sees is a lamb. And then the lamb grabs the scroll from the right hand of the one on the throne. Okay. Well, lambs do not have hands. They got trotters, little pokers. Right. And you think, well, that's Lambs can't do this, and they
Right.
can't stand on two legs and grab it with their. So it's got this sort of make believe zaniness, bizarreness about it that gets fun rather than gruesomely literal. We should see this as we should read it the way we read the Lord of the Rings.
Right.
Is important.
Right.
And let's say the last thing I would say is be very careful about taking the judgments of chapters 6 through 16 as literal predictions of what will happen on planet Earth. You cannot toss stars on the Earth and survive. It's just not going to happen. So it's sort of unrealistic at some level, but cool because it's beyond the literal.
I'm kind of curious. I interviewed Bart Ehrman because he just released a book as well on Revelation called Armageddon. And his take is pretty much like Revelation is an incredibly violent book and paints a version of Jesus that wants to kill everyone. That's pretty much like his take in my interview with him. And he points to his sources, and he says he used to read it as more of a, in a way of like, Empire bad, New Jerusalem good. But as he read it closer, he was like, this is a pretty violent book. And even our podcast title was like Jesus the Peacemaker versus Jesus the Executioner. How do you look at how Jesus is portrayed in Revelation? What are some of your thoughts on that in particular? And, frankly, just some of the violence that we see in the book. Like you said, to your point, I'm not saying we should take it literally, but there's still some violent imagery in the book itself.
Yeah. Well, yes, it is. But here's the odd thing. Bart is not alone with people who want to criticize the book of Revelation and criticize dispensationalists for their literalism.
Yeah.
But then they opt for literalism to use against the literalist interpretation, right?
I guess
so they
fair.
Want this to be literal. Yeah. They want this to be literal in order to get their negative point about Jesus. I don't think it's literal. So, and I don't think that those descriptions, there's a scene, pretty gruesome, of the lamb, the white horse rider, that's pretty stiff stuff. But it's like the Iliad and the Odyssey and Virgil's Aeneid. It's like anything in the ancient world that is describing it. When you choose, this is the way I would respond to Bart Ehrman. And I like to read Bart Ehrman. He's quite the writer.
Same.
But I would say this is that when John chose to write apocalyptic literature, he was locked into apocalyptic literature. And apocalyptic literature does this stuff. All of it is like this. Yes, it is violent, and it can produce people who want violence.
Yeah.
And that's sad because I don't think that's what John would say, but this is a story like Star Wars, and of good and evil, and it is a story of good winning and evil losing. And if you're going to make it into a cosmic battle, you're going to have cosmic scenes that look pretty cosmic, pretty serious stuff.
Yeah, for sure.
And so I think that's where I think Bart is right. And Greg Carey is a good scholar of Revelation. He's a specialist in it. I see why they would say that John sort of undoes Rome by being like Rome.
Yeah.
One ups them. I can see why they say that. But what happens if we turn it into fiction of good and evil? What happens then? Is it then to be taken literally? It could be used by people in a bad way, but no, that's not the way this book's supposed to be read, I don't think.
I like that, and I appreciate that. I knew after I interviewed Bart, I said, if I'm interviewing Scot McKnight on this, I got to ask him that question, what his take on some of these perspectives would be, because I think a lot of us are realizing, again, just like how complicated this stuff is. And people like me who are not academics, we're not scholars, right? We rely on folks like yourself and others to just help us understand on a deeper level beyond just the black and white English text, and then also the culture that we were kind of taught to interpret it through. And that's kind of my next question for you is, I realized, even when I was still more a conservative evangelical, I realized pretty quickly, well, if like every 50 years someone else claims to have this secret formula to revelation in the end times. I mean, in my case, it was Harold Camping was one of them. I think about. I listen to on the radio all the time.
Campion?
Yeah, all the time. Right?
I remember. Was it 88 or something like that?
Yeah, something like that, right?
Yeah.
And then I think to myself, like, and maybe this is more just I'm asking for your speculation. But why do you think this? Like every generation, there are people who, knowing that people before them have done the same thing and have totally missed it, still insists that no, they have a new interpretation of Revelation that definitely predicts the end of the world, and this person's definitely the Antichrist. Like, why this cycle that we find ourselves in? I feel like every couple of years, I just don't understand it.
Well, Tim, you're right. This is the irony of the interpretation since the medieval days, and so yes, every generation has its predictors who think this, they've got it, and they're proven to be wrong. Okay, here's the big thing.
Yeah,
everybody who's operated in reading the book of Revelation this way has been proven to be wrong.
Yeah.
Okay, so we need to start there. Something's wrong if everybody is always wrong. Okay, right. So let me put it this way. They had their chance to read the book of Revelation right as apocalyptic, but instead they read it as predictive prophecy, and it led them to speculation. For instance, yes, Putin is an Antichrist figure, especially for Ukrainians.
Sure.
Okay?
Yep.
Yes, Hitler was an Antichrist figure for England, for Russia, for Italy, for France, for Amsterdam, for Jews everywhere. Okay? Yeah. Antichrist figure. The Antichrist predicted in Revelation 13? No. And that's where they fail. Instead of seeing that this book gives them categories for discerning political corruption at the level of tyranny and power mongering and empire, they've turned it away from apocalyptic theological discipleship, discernment, toward prediction. And when they do that, they are wrong, but they get everybody's attention because they think, man, maybe. I mean, I remember in 1973, I came home from college. I think it was spring break. I'm not certain. I'll just say it this way now. Some loony bin from Jerry Falwell's college. At that time, I think it was called, it wasn't called Liberty University yet, I don't think. Something else. He came in and predicted the coming of Christ, and it was compelling by 1978. So I said to my youth pastor, do you think I should even go back to college? I mean, I was serious. Wow. I was so sold out and on fire. I thought, man, I just need to go evangelize the world. And he says, he could be wrong, so you better go just in case he's wrong. Well, here I am.
Yeah, here you are.
Probably 50 years later, still here, not left behind. So I think the biggest problem, Tim, is that they're reading the book wrong. They're using it for the wrong. But I think a lot of them have discerned evil in political leaders in the world who deserve to be denounced. I mean, who could be an African in South Africa and see what happened with the Reformed Church, whatever you want to call it, of South Africa with apartheid, and not think that this is evil?
Right.
That's Antichrist right there. Right. That's Babylon. That's what the book helps us do. So.
I really like that you said it gives us categories instead of like looking for specific people, right? Who are that one person that we're talking about? Because you're right. I mean, people can do good and bad, right? And we see people, especially leaders, a lot of times who behave in antichrist ways, right? And that's important. Yeah. One of the questions I have for you, and let's kind of bring this into like our modern moment, right? So I would argue that most Christians, specifically in America, are not living under the boot of the empire, right? In a lot of ways, frankly, we are the empire. Christians dominate in America regarding either in politics. It's mostly Christians who get elected, to having our own industries, our own publishing, music, movie industries. We're very well established here. In fact, some people argue that we're a Christian nation and that Christians should be the ones writing the laws, flat out. So what do we do with Revelation for a group of Christians who maybe arguably are the most privileged Christians to ever exist in the world, with an exorbitant amount of freedom? What do we do with the book that seems like it's really critiquing what happens when empire is, or I should say, it's critiquing from the underside of empire, not from being kind of the empire or supported by the empire? What do we do with it?
Well, I totally agree with you about this Christian nationalism impulse in the United States. I've had a lot of exposure and reading. I consider myself an Anabaptist, so I've often called it Constantinianism because of Constantine. That's more of an Anabaptist hermeneutic. But the rise of Christian nationalism is what I would call an almost pristine example of Babylon. This is Babylon. This is what the dragon wants. He wants people in the Capitol building threatening to tear down the place and to think they can make it a Christian nation. Jesus doesn't win with a sword in his fist, but by the word that comes from his mouth. That's a huge difference there. And violence is not the way of the Lamb. The way of the dragon is violence. So to me, the capitulation in the Reagan years, in the 1980s, of evangelical Christians to the Republican Party, and it has become radicalized in American culture to the point of Republicans are right no matter how ridiculous it can look.
Yeah.
And Republicans are Christians and Democrats are not. And no matter what the Democrats are for, we're against it. That's sort of right there, that alignment with the Republican Party. I see this in lesser forms among progressives at times.
Sure.
But I see it especially in the Christian nationalism today that has been exposed by Samuel Perry at the University of Oklahoma.
He's great.
And Philip Gorski at Yale. Their scholarship on this is, to me, just amazing, and it's really, really helpful.
Yep.
And I was with Samuel. I was just with Samuel Perry in Oklahoma.
I
really
love that. Yeah.
Yeah,
Sam's great. I've had him on the podcast a few times. Wonderful.
Oh, you have?
Well, we talk pretty often because we both talk behind the scenes about, hey, did you see this? Did you see that? Okay. So we track this stuff together.
I think that this is Tim, I'll put it this way. Because of the Left Behind series, because of the nonsense of speculation in the populist dispensational mindset, I know Darrell Bach at Dallas is not one of these people, but because of the populist understanding of this, a whole generation, 2 generations, have been educated in the church not to think critically of political powers, but to choose their party. And in choosing the party, they're choosing God's party, God's nation. America is favored in the world, and they have failed to read the book of Revelation well, and they have failed what I call a theopolitical hermeneutic of discipleship. They've failed it, and this is why we have Christian nationalists today.
Man, I gotta be honest, Scott. I appreciate you saying that stuff just so directly because people need to hear it. They need to hear people say what needs to be said, you know? And I think one of the things I wrestle with, I would love your insight and wisdom here, as someone who, you know, has been an academic and teaching for 40 plus years. I think where a lot of us struggle is I realize that we live in a 2-party binary. All right. We live in a Democrat, Republican, you know, political system. And I think a lot of us would say, listen, we all saw what happened with Trump. Trump is like this figure that people are rallying behind, the almost like a cult of personality. And because of that, a lot of us have, I mean, I can say personally, I voted for the first time in my life for a Democrat in this past election. I voted for Joe Biden. And I was like, okay. And I think sometimes I get worried where it's like, I don't want to come across like a left-wing ideologue, but in this current moment that we exist in, I just see much better ways of being Christian and voting for things that I think are more committed to human flourishing by voting for a Democrat, even though I'm not a big fan that Joe Biden's running again. I'm not, I don't have allegiance to Joe Biden, right? But I think a lot of us feel stuck in this, like, well, if my tradition is extreme right, is me thinking that maybe Joe Biden is a better option? Is that me now becoming an extreme ideologue on the left, even though I don't want to be? How would you speak to Christians who are feeling that tension and who want to, not become a fundamentalist all over again, but also realize that in our current cultural moment, we have to take a stand for something and make decisions somewhere?
Okay, Tim. I know that tension, and I remember when James Davison Hunter wrote his book called The Culture Wars. It was a long time ago, but he pointed to something going on in the post-Reagan years. It was very important. He perceived sooner than most, earlier than any that I know of, that what was going on in evangelicalism was a culture war at a very significant level, and it has only gotten cataclysmically worse since then.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I chose about 16 years ago, 12 years ago, not to vote. Not to vote for a presidential election. Not, voting locally is a completely different thing. It's not a war. I don't want to participate in the culture war of pretending that if we get the right president in Washington, D.C., America is going to be saved and is going to bring in the kingdom of God.
Sure.
I am not against voting at all. I don't see a problem with that. But I don't want to participate in that. I want to maintain a capacity to critique both parties and to affirm both parties. I want to stand prophetically over against Washington, D.C. as an American citizen, not pro right side of the cabinet or pro left side, of in the Capitol. I don't want to stand like that, but I don't have a problem with any evangelical Christian voting Democrat. I don't think that's a problem. And here's why. I mean, other than the fact that I want to be prophetically independent so that I can speak more accurately. But do most American Christians realize that virtually all European evangelicals are social democrats? And they think our Democratic Party is right wing.
Totally. I know.
I was in Denmark one day, and this guy who was a political theorist, he said to me, in our country, we think that it was Obama. Who did Obama run against? Mitt
Romney and McCain.
Mitt Romney. Okay, that's who he said. He said, we think Obama and Romney are virtually identical politically. And it just proves that evangelicalism does not have to be aligned with any political party. If these people were living in Denmark, they don't even have people to vote for on what they're talking about. Right. They're going to vote for a social democrat.
Right.
So I think that it's a massive mistake that occurred because of Ronald Reagan, the Evangelical Alliance of the Moral Majority with Jerry Falwell, James Dobson, and James Kennedy, who were opposed at the time by the other Jim Wallace.
Yep.
And they were at odds. And Jim Wallace, I think, has been more independent than those others, but he still has been a little bit too aligned for me with a political party. Bless his heart. He's been very helpful for me over the years. But I think that we need to be much more discerning politically, prophetically, of what it means to be a dissident disciple who follow the Lamb and who can discern the presence of Babylon wherever it begins to show up.
I appreciate that, I think, a ton. I think to give you just, we have about 4 minutes left, so just maybe to close the conversation, I think the reason why I voted, first off, in 2016, I voted third party. I was like, hey, I can't do this Trump thing. I can't do the Hillary thing. Vote third party. I voted for Biden, and I'll probably vote for him again because I don't think we could survive the direction of how far right our right wing has gone. I mean, an insurrection that happened on the 6th is a historical moment in our country. And I really thought that was going to be a wake-up call for specifically evangelical culture to say, what have we done? And here we are 6 years later, and right-wing pundits are only more entrenched in those spaces, pushing the same nonsense. You know, I think we could survive Joe Biden, or really any Democrat that would run, compared to another 4 years of this straight up. I mean, this is me talking. I'm not putting words in your mouth, but for me, I would argue borderline fascist tendencies that we're seeing in far right spaces. I mean, one example I tell people is Marjorie Taylor Greene, who spoke at Nick Fuentes's white supremacist rally, took over for Speaker McCarthy when he couldn't make it in the House of Representatives. To have a woman like that, you know, running the House session for a day, I think just shows you how far one political party has moved compared to the other. Yeah. So for me, I
agree with you, Tim.
But again, I don't want to become an ideologue. I'm not saying you're never going to see a Joe Biden flag on my front yard. You know what I mean? Yeah. But I just think in this cultural moment, I have to do whatever I can to resist what I'm seeing happening in these far right spaces. So anyway, that's just where I land personally right now.
And I think voting is one way of resisting. And so I get nervous about joining the culture war. That's where it's in, but we can speak up and we can speak out. And I have a fairly sizable platform at times. You know, I got 65,000 Twitter followers. Yeah, I can say something politically. I have a Substack. I write books. I can say these things, and that's where I want to use my voice to speak against political corruption. Yeah. And when it seems like right now the choices are between DeSantis and Trump, it's not looking good for Republicans and for evangelical Christians who want to align themselves that way. I think that's capitulation to Babylon.
Yeah, I tend to agree. Scott, I appreciate you making time. Where can folks find you? You mentioned you have a Substack. You're on Twitter. Plug those channels away so people can find you.
Yeah, I mean, Scot McKnight. I have one T in Scott on Twitter. I have a Facebook account. You can find me easily there. And on Substack, it's, you know, my name with Substack. And I send something out every day of the week.
Awesome. Well,
world without end. Hallelujah. Amen.
Amen. Friends, the book is Revelation for the Rest of Us, a prophetic call to follow Jesus as a dissident disciple. Scott, I appreciate your time. Thank you for making time. And I'm sure we'll talk again. So keep in touch.
Thank you, Tim.